Well, I try to do this briefly because there are really a lot of things to say about this. And I think it is very important that we emphasize that we're operating in the dark without autopsy photos and, a lot of other surveillance, camera, images and all kinds of other things that would be very valuable here. But that having been said, I think it's important to point out that what we're dealing with here, by any definition, whether it be the FBI crime classification manual definition, or the less conservative definition one sees in the literature on mass murder, we're dealing with a mass murderer here. This is somebody who killed 4 victims at one time in one location. We have no reason to believe yet that this is somebody who went on to kill again, killed in close proximity in time to the offense, killed before with any kind of cooling off period. Now, I can tell you, I was the lead author on, along with Dr. Raghi Burgess. We co-created the Columbia Mass Murder Database during my time at Columbia Medical Center. That's, to my knowledge, the largest study done to date of mass murder worldwide. And I think it gives a little bit of information that might be helpful here. What we found is that what really matters is the weapon. And the fact that we're dealing with a mass murder that involved something other than a gun is very critical. So, turns out from that very large data set that when we're looking at the use of a weapon other than a gun, the likelihood that we're dealing with somebody who has some odd characteristics that might be considered to be on the spectrum of being authentically disturbed is greatly increased, significantly increased. However, there is also a subset of people who use weapons other than guns that do so because they have a lot of the psychopathic characteristics like we see in people that are more likely to be serial offenders. Now, I will say that about 11.78% of the people in our database did in fact turn out to commit mass murder as part of a wider pattern of serial killing, but we don't know yet what's going to go on here. Now, my guess, based on the data, is that this is a person that I do believe is male. 97% of mass murderers are male, we found. I do not believe that this is somebody who operated with another person because I think by definition, this is an odd person who would have difficulty establishing relationships. I imagine this to be a person who would live a very restricted mechanical existence with a temper, a little bit of a paranoid quality that you would stay away from because you would sense that they were peculiar and that they were a little hot-headed, and a person that could really hold a grudge for a long time. I believe, based on the data that we have, that we're looking at one of two things. If this is a person who snapped emotionally and committed an impulsive kind of mass murder, then a knife would be chosen simply because it was around, and it's sort of like some of the mass murders we see, like in China, for example. There's a phenomenon where a mother, let's say, who is depressed, possibly psychotic, picks up a blade and goes to a school and kills children because she's in despair about her own life, that kind of thing. But the other thing you see are people who would choose a knife because of its intimacy with the victims, because of the enormous amount of pain that it would give, because of its possible symbolic sexual quality, because the person sees himself as delivering justice, a kind of a hunter figure who goes in like a mission. And what seems to distinguish between these more impulsive mass murderers and these people that are more psychopathic is that there isn't the impulse component. They methodically monitor, have a grudge, and plan to go in. And what I envision is a person who would treat this evening, this morning, early morning killing, the way we would think about a major event in our lives, like a wedding or having a child or something. It was like D-Day that went in after a period of probably stalking, watching, and committed this act in a kind of an explosion of frenzy, right? But this is not a person who you would picture afterwards to have regret or to say, why did I do this? But a person who would feel a very great deal of satisfaction. We also have to picture an individual who did so probably in the dark, unless he had some kind of military equipment or a headlight on his head or something. But I think that figures into this too. because remember, there is no overt sexual quality to this crime. There may be an undertone of it, and was certainly somebody who contributed to the literature meaningfully about how there can be undertones of sexuality in some of these people. But what it looks like is that this might have been motivated more by some kind of anger or grudge or resentment or misogyny or envy, something like that. And somebody who did so after a cool-headed reflection that they wanted to do this. The sexual component is important because if it's missing, then what you're probably looking at is somebody driven by a wound to the ego. Now, my final point I'll make is that when you have some of these ego-driven killers, you notice that a lot of them do their killing from behind the curtain or in the dark. I think that's very important that this was done in the dark. Think, for example, of the serial killer Robert Hansen, who hunted women in the forest, shooting them from behind in the dark. That's because if they turned around and saw him, he was just a little nobody. But from behind and in the dark, he was everything. He was a god. And I think that that's important because for some of these people, like you'll notice that with serial killers, for example, where there's no overt sexual component, a lot of them will do things like write to the police and boast and seek attention and enjoy that they're slithering underneath you like a serpent that could strike at any time. The ego ultimately catches them too. It's their undoing. But the ego drives a lot of it. And I suspect that ego figures very heavily into this case, and that this is somebody who feels he was basically terrifying everybody and enjoys sitting back and saying, now all the women of the world are terrified that I could strike at any time. In other words, this person doesn't know if he is everything or nothing. Is he a god or is he a nobody? But in the dark, committing those crimes, I imagine he felt something like the deliverer of justice.
Fascinating.
Sorry,
Thank
I was
you.
muted. But there are some mass murderers that operate in teams, but you can count on a few hands the number of mass murders that are not associated with gangs or criminal enterprise, mafia killings, things like that, where you're going to have more than one offender working together. There are some, usually involving a very psychopathic leader figure and a kind of weaker-willed figure that works alongside them to eliminate a group of people. But I suspect that the essence of this case is the isolation of the offender, the difficulty forming any kind of allegiance or alliance to a human being. So consequently, I am convinced this is probably a lone wolf offender. And I think these questions Anne is raising about the absence of a lot of of evidence really speaks to the planning and the fact that this is not an impulsive mass murder. And as I was emphasizing earlier, that really alters our profile, because once we're dealing with somebody that planned something like this and went in and did it, carried it out like that, you've got to imagine a person who, in the cool light of reason, could think of doing something like this and carry it out without, and be rational enough in the moment to do something like, for example, did he wear booties or something like, why was he not covered in blood, leaving trail, did he bring a change of clothes? Did he? And I have to tell you, I envision a person who went in there dressed for the occasion. He probably had that knife kind of hanging at his side and kind of wearing stuff to dark clothing. And, I really picture somebody who went in like he was going in for a mission. And, so that, this point about the evidence, I think, has to be explored further. Tells you a lot about the offender, I think.
Interesting. Great.
Well, as I had mentioned earlier, the knife is sometimes chosen in a mass murder because you're dealing with somebody a little more mentally ill who can't access a gun or so. But I think what we're dealing with here is somebody who chose it because of its intimacy with the victims, because of the power that was felt coming close to the victims and kind of jabbing them with this, one might argue, phallic kind of instrument of power, domination, control over the victims. And I would imagine, I'm not sure about this, but having talked to offenders and read about offenders who use knives, that some of these people have a very intimate relationship with this knife. It's like a thing they love. It's an extension of themselves. They've used it sometimes to kill animals or so forth, or cherished it, and I think that the killing with this knife is extremely important. And incidentally, on the subject of hunting, Anne has raised a point previously about this case, I think is an excellent one, is that this is somebody we would expect to keep something from this, like a trophy, because I think he's very proud of this, as Greg was mentioning earlier. I think like we would keep a memento of a very important event. I could really see this guy cherishing this knife and keeping some memento, so that Anne, can of course speak to this, but one of the suggestions that Anne had made was that if it was possible to do an inventory of what might be missing from that house, it's important because we have no idea what this guy might have kept. But I think he chose that knife because this is a cold-blooded, calculating kind of an individual who went in with the idea to inflict a lot of pain, a lot of horror, and an intimate kind of a style of killing. I happen to be very interested in this roughly 12% of mass murderers that prove to actually be serial killers. And it's important to understand that when you're looking at mass murder, the vast majority of people who commit it are people who are emotionally overwhelmed by a life event, like a loss of a job or school or a loved one or whatever, because these are individuals whose entire identity tends to be rooted in one thing that gives a sort of scope to who they are, a purpose of, and they lose it and sort of explode. And sometimes express envy that other people have things that they don't. But there is this sort of subset of mass murders, and I think that's where this person falls, that look a lot more like serial killers, because what you see is not the kind of popping that but more plotting, methodically going out and committing, so that you're not really seething with rage impulsively, but you have this capacity to, in a kind of reptilian way, strike and observe and be callous and fearless, and so you start to get hints that this is somebody with a more psychopathic quality. Now, what's interesting is if this person goes on to be a serial killer, what kind of serial killer would he be? Well, the vast majority of serial killers are sexually motivated. That's the huge bucket into which most, particularly post-1960s serial killers fall. But then you have other types. And one of the types is this more mission-oriented, not particularly sexual type, or at least overtly sexual type, where we would see people like David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, the Zodiac Killer, Ted Kaczynski, serial killers that have a kind of they're angry about something. They're misanthropes, or they hate women, but they're not overtly perverse, sexually perverse. And what's interesting about that kind of person is they have a trait in common, which is that they're very driven by the need for the public to admire them or be afraid of them. It's an ego thing, and they tend to contact law enforcement. Son of Sam did that, Zodiac Killer did that, Ted Kaczynski did that, etc. So the idea being that the motivation is much more about that I want to assert domination and control, not only over women, the victim in the moment, but I want the whole public to be afraid of me, almost as if I'm a kind of god. And what I think is that if this person goes on to be a serial killer, we would have somebody who was motivated probably from childhood, probably has been fantasizing for a long time about asserting domination and control over people, probably a woman. I agree with Greg's point about that. But the expression of that is not overtly sexual. It's more generalized. It's a kind of hatred that is overarching. And I think this is the kind of person who wants people to know what he did. And
So I have a question on that.
This is the person who, yes, I think this is a person who probably monitors the press, may even collect the press about himself. I think this is a person who would become furious if somebody said something about him that wasn't true or weakened him. And I think this is the kind of person that can be drawn out hopefully by law enforcement because of his ego. We've seen offenders like this, for example, where there's a public event where the public is asked about their thoughts on the offense, or there's some giving of evidence or so. And we find that these people are present in the audience, or ask questions, or attend the funerals of the victims, or participate in memorial events and things. And I can't help but feel this is the kind of person whose ego will trip him up. I think that this is a person who and would inveigle himself into the investigation and what is going on and monitor it in the same way he probably stalked the victims. Because we see that in the types of serial killers, the types of offenders who are not sexually motivated in an overt way. Now, the other thing to mention is that about half of mass murderers take their own lives. One of the things I think we have to think about here is the possibility that the final expression of ego with this kind of person would be to slip away from law enforcement, take their own life, and that would be the end of the person. Then we would find that out later. But that is more common when mass murderers use guns, not when they would employ a blade like this. So I suspect this person is out there and possibly even watching this.